Hi friends. Today I'm going to read chapter 5 of our book, Because of Winn-Dixie, written by Kate DiCamillo and published by Scholastic Readers. Wow, our last chapter was really kind of sad, wasn't it? Do you remember what we learned in our last chapter? It was when Opal asked her daddy to tell her 10 things about her mama. We had learned that Opal's mama had left the family when Opal was 3 years old, and we don't know why. But Opal asked her daddy to tell her 10 things about her mama because she didn't know anything about her. And so Opal's daddy told her 10 things. And some of those things were happy, and some of those things were funny, and some of those things were a little bit sad, right? And so we've talked a little bit about character. That is the people that are in our stories. Right now we know Opal, and we know Winn-Dixie, and we know the daddy or the preacher. She calls him the preacher. And now we know a little bit about Opal's mama. And then we have talked about, but I haven't mentioned what it's called, we've talked about the plot, which is the storyline or what happens in the story. So each time we talk a little bit about what has happened in the chapter that comes before or the story that comes before. That's called the plot. Every story has a plot. So when you write your stories, in order to make them interesting, your reader is going to want you to write something happen in the story. And the plot has a good beginning, and a good middle, and a good end. So far, we've got the beginning. And our beginning of this story is that Opal meets Winn-Dixie in a grocery store. We learn a little bit about her moving to this new town and feeling lonely, right? And we learn about her not having a mama and missing her mama and not feeling like her daddy really knows her or talks to her very much. So she feels lonely about that too. That's the beginning of our story. We're still learning a little bit more about the beginning, and we're going to learn it a little more in the next few chapters. And then we're going to get to the middle, okay? That's the plot. The other thing about a story, we've talked about character. That's who is in the story. The plot is what happens in the story. Another thing about a story is called the setting, or where it takes place, okay? So one thing we've learned about the story so far is that it takes place in a small town that's smaller than a city, like Grand Rapids. It's just very small. Not very many people live there. Not very many buildings, not tall buildings, right? Very small town in southern Florida. And Florida is even in the south of the United States. And remember, I told you that it's very warm in Florida. Yep. And so that's kind of, and we also know that Opal lives in a trailer. Not in a house, but a trailer. A trailer is just, it's really pretty much a smaller house, okay? It's really quite small. So she lives in a trailer that's in a trailer park. And we know that the trailer park really only allows adults, and Opal's an exception. She's allowed special to be there because she's a child, and this trailer park does not have children in it, which means it's even more lonely for her because there's no children in her neighborhood. In chapter 5, we're going to learn about another setting. And this setting or place that we're going to learn about is the church that her daddy works at. Remember, a minister or a preacher is in charge of or runs the church. So we're going to learn about the church, okay? Listen to this part of the story and see if you can picture in your mind what this church is like. Okay, here we go. Winn-Dixie couldn't stand to be left alone. We found that out real quick. If me and the preacher went off and left him by himself in the trailer, he pulled all the cushions off the couch and all the toilet paper off the roll. So we started tying him up outside with a rope when we left. That didn't work either. Winn-Dixie howled until Samuel, Mrs. Detweiler's dog, started howling too. Do you know what it sounds like when a dog howls? Oh gosh, it's loud and not very nice. It was exactly the kind of noise that people in an all-adult trailer park do not like to hear. He just doesn't want to be left alone, I told the preacher. That's all. Let's take him with us. I could understand the way Winn-Dixie felt. Getting left behind probably made his heart feel empty. After a while, the preacher gave in, and everywhere we went, we took Winn-Dixie, even to church. The Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi isn't a regular-looking church. The building used to be a pick-it-quick grocery store. So it's kind of like a dollar store or so, okay? So a pick-it-quick store. And when you walk in the front door, the first thing you see is the pick-it-quick motto. It's written on the floor in little red tiny tiles that make great big letters that say, pick, 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 quick, quick, quick. The preacher tried painting over those tiles, but the letters won't stay covered up, and so the preacher has just given up and let them be. Okay, so this church is not in a typical church building like we usually have churches, where you have a big steeple and you have pews in the church where you sit, and it's in a brick building like a church looks like. This is in like a dollar store. Picture what a dollar store looks like. And this doesn't have things in it anymore. They took all the stuff out. But now that's where the church is being held, is in what used to be a dollar store. Okay? The other thing about the Open Arms, that's what they call their church, Open Arms. Like open arms, right? Like we're going to welcome you all in. That's why they call it Open Arms. That is different from other churches is there aren't any pews. Pews are those benches that you sit on sometimes in church. Now maybe you go to church and maybe your church has chairs. But lots of churches have these long benches that you sit in at church. Well, Open Arms doesn't have pews or benches. People bring their own fold-up chairs and their lawn chairs. And so sometimes it looks more like the congregation, that means the people that go to church, is watching a parade or sitting at a barbecue instead of being at church. It's kind of a strange church. And I thought Winn-Dixie would fit right in, because Winn-Dixie's maybe a little bit strange too. But the first time we brought Winn-Dixie to the Open Arms, the preacher tied him outside the front door. Why did we bring him all the way here just to tie him up? I asked the preacher. Because dogs don't belong in church, Opal, the preacher said. That's why. He tied Winn-Dixie up to a tree and said how there was lots of shade for him, and that ought to work out real good. Well, it didn't. The service started, and there was some singing, and some sharing, and some praying, and then the preacher started preaching. And he wasn't but 2 or 3 words into his sermon when there was a terrible howl coming from outside. The preacher tried to ignore it, not pay attention to it. Today, he said. "Ow!" said Winn-Dixie. "Please," said the preacher. "Ow!" said Winn-Dixie back. "Friends," said the preacher. "Ow!" wailed Winn-Dixie. Everyone turned in their lawn chairs and fold-up chairs and looked at one another. "Opal," said the preacher. "Ow!" said Winn-Dixie. Yes, sir, I said. Go get that dog, he yelled. Yes, sir, I yelled back. I went outside and untied Winn-Dixie and brought him inside. And he sat down beside me and smiled up at the preacher. And the preacher couldn't help it. He smiled back. Winn-Dixie had that effect on him. And so the preacher started in preaching again. Winn-Dixie sat there listening to it, wiggling his ears this way and that, trying to catch all the words. And everything would have been all right, except that a mouse ran across the floor. The open arms had mice. They were there from when it was a picket quick, and there were lots of good things to eat in the building. And when the picket quick became the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi, the mice stayed around to eat all the leftover crumbs from the potluck suppers. The preacher kept on saying he was going to have to do something about them, but he never did. Because the truth is, he couldn't stand the thought of hurting anything, even a mouse. Well, Winn-Dixie saw that mouse, and he was up and after him. 1 minute, everything was quiet and serious, and the preacher was going on and on and on. And the next minute, can you picture it? Can you see it in your head? Winn-Dixie looked like a furry bullet shooting across the building, chasing that mouse. He was barking, and his feet were skidding all over the polished picket quick floor. Can you picture that slippery floor that you have at a dollar store or at a grocery store, and the dog is running across it and slipping and sliding all over? People were clapping and hollering and pointing. They really went wild when Winn-Dixie actually caught the mouse. I have never in my life seen a dog catch a mouse, said Mrs. Nordley. She was sitting next to me. He's a special dog, I told her. I imagine so, she said back. Winn-Dixie stood up there in front of the whole church, wagging his tail and holding the mouse real careful in his mouth, holding on to him tight, but not squishing him. I believe that mutt has got some retriever in him, said somebody behind me. He's a hunting dog. Winn-Dixie took the mouse over to the preacher and dropped it at his feet. And when that mouse tried to get away, Winn-Dixie put his paw right on the mouse's tail. Then he smiled up at the preacher. Can you picture all of this happening when it's happening? That's what good readers do. They pretend like the movie is going on in their mind, and they picture all the things that are happening that the author is telling them, okay? Then he smiled up at the preacher. He showed him all his teeth. The preacher looked down at the mouse. He looked at Winn-Dixie. He looked at me. He rubbed his nose. It got real quiet in the picket quick. Let us pray, the preacher finally said, for this mouse. And everybody started laughing and clapping. The preacher picked up the mouse by the tail and walked and threw it out the front door of the picket quick. And everybody applauded. That means clapped again. Then he came back and we all prayed together. I prayed for my mama. I told God how much she would have enjoyed hearing the story of Winn-Dixie catching that mouse. It would have made her laugh. I asked God if maybe I could be the one to tell her that story someday. And then I talked to God about how I was lonely in Naomi because I didn't know that many kids, only the ones from church. And there weren't that many kids in the Open Arms, just Dunlap and Stevie Dewberry, two brothers who weren't twins but kind of looked like they were, and Amanda Wilkinson, whose face was always pinched up like she was smelling something really bad, and Sweetie Pie Thomas, who was only 5 years old and still mostly a baby. And none of them wanted to be my friend anyway, because they probably thought I would tell on them to the preacher for every little thing they did wrong. And then they would get in trouble with God and their parents. So I told God that I was lonely, even having Winn-Dixie. And finally, I prayed for the mouse, like the preacher suggested. I prayed that he didn't get hurt when he went flying out of the door of the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. I prayed that he landed on a nice soft patch of grass.